Hey Youth Fam, it's Brandon, Youth Pastor for Simple Church. And today I get the opportunity of continuing our series, Waitlisted, where we've been talking about this season of waiting known as Advent. And just as a refresher, Advent is the season of the year that leads up to Christmas. And is observed with various traditions and rituals by many different religions, but the word Advent itself means the arrival of a notable person, thing, or event. Basically, for us as Christians, Advent is us as God's people waiting for the return of Christ. But as we've been talking about this, it doesn't take long to realize that Advent isn't the only season we have to wait. And I'm sure, like me, many of you have had moments in your life where you feel like you're waiting and waiting and waiting. And so I wonder, where is it or what is it that you really hate to wait? When or where do you feel like you get the most impatient? For me, one of these places has to be customer service. Like, I hate having to wait over the phone when I call to get help for something. You know, like when you get that automated message, the next caller will be with you in approximately 65 minutes. I hate this so much, you guys. Like, I hate it so much, I often put off getting help until it's my last resort. But even waiting on the phone pales in comparison to being in person. At least while I'm waiting on the phone, I can find something else to do while they play that awful background music. For example, having to wait while in a fast food drive-thru may be one of the worst things ever, especially when cars start to pile up behind you. Like when you drive up and nobody says anything and you look at the intercom and hello, and you get that classic, oh, we'll be with you in just a minute. What do you mean you'll be with me in just a minute? I've been waiting here for 5 minutes already. But no, it gets worse. It gets worse. Every once in a while, you'll get that one guy, right? Like maybe you guys have experienced this, that guy who feels like they have to yell into the microphone to be heard. Can I get your order? Yeah, I'll take a number 6. You get 6? Anything else? No. I want a number 6, the double cheeseburger and fries. No, God, this is gonna take forever. But when I really think about why this frustrates me so much, I think it's because in these moments, I don't feel heard. I don't feel listened to. I don't feel understood. And so I wonder, where have you felt this lately? Maybe for you, it's not a customer service call or a fast food drive-thru, but something a little more serious, like a teacher who won't listen to your side of the story, or a friend who never asks what you want to do, or a sibling who assumes they know what's best for you, or a parent who you feel doesn't understand you or even get you at all. The reality is we all want to be listened to, right? We want to know that our voices matter, that people care about what we have to say, that someone is listening. And it's when we don't feel this happening that we begin to almost scream inside or maybe even out loud, listen to me. And I think this is especially true during difficult moments, when we're feeling frustrated, afraid, confused, or anxious. It means a lot in these moments to know we have someone to talk to and that someone is listening. And so I ask again, do you feel heard? Do you feel listened to? Do you feel cared about? And this question may never be more important than when it comes to our Creator. Do you feel heard by God? Or do you find yourself asking, does God really hear me? And this certainly became a question for me as I came to know Jesus and began to have a relationship with him. And along with it, started to feel like an outcast in my family. Like any time I would spend time with my family out of state, I would feel attacked and belittled for what I believed. So I'd pray to God asking for the right things to say, opportunities to love on my family and hearts to be changed. Yet year after year, it has felt the same. I feel like I'm continually looked at as being naive in what I believe or judgmental for not simply accepting what others believe. And so I start to ask God, do you hear me? Will this ever change? And so I don't know if you have a story like mine or maybe relate with something more like a relationship that has turned negative despite all your attempts to make it better. Or a bully that won't leave you alone, or a sick family member that things still haven't turned around for. No matter what it is for you, I want you to know something. I want you to know you're not alone. Whether it's because you're wrestling with doubt or experiencing a tragedy or walking through a difficult circumstance, it's understandable if you sometimes wonder, is God really listening to me? In fact, there's someone in Scripture who asked this very question. His name is David, and he's one of the most famous figures from the Bible. Maybe you've heard of David and Goliath or the name King David. Well, that's him. And to give you a little bit of context as to why he is important to what we are talking about today, let me give you a little background on his story that we find in 1 Samuel. See, while David was a young boy in the land of Israel, there was this man named Saul who was king. And although God had originally chosen Saul to be king of Israel, Saul's actions had caused him to lose God's blessing and favor. And so God was on the lookout for a new king. And God found the new king in David, this young shepherd boy. But because David was so young, small, and unassuming, he was almost overlooked. But God saw him. And so God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint David with oil, symbolizing that David would one day become king. That's a pretty awesome promise, right? But what God didn't tell David at that time was that David would need to wait for that promise to be fulfilled. And the waiting would be really difficult. After this, we are told that King Saul's armies were being attacked by their enemies, the Philistines, including this giant of a man named Goliath. No one wanted to fight Goliath, but David was up for the challenge. He trusted God would be with him and faced off against Goliath, holding only a slingshot and a few rocks. And he won. And then at King Saul's request, David got to start hanging around Saul the king. Pretty cool, right? Saul even recognized David's talent as a musician and asked David to play songs on his harp. But this relationship didn't last long. Soon after it began, Saul began growing jealous of David. He couldn't stand how much everyone loved David, how talented he was, or how he seemed to have God's favor. Saul grew so angry that he tried to kill David by throwing spears at him. And things got so bad that David fled the kingdom while Saul and his men hunted and continued trying to kill him. Saul's men even chased David from city to city. And so basically, it's a pretty long and dramatic story that you can read about in the book of 1 Samuel. But in the end, Saul eventually dies in battle. And when he did, David was made king and was no longer waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled. And I tell you all this because it's important to know that David's path to the throne wasn't what he wanted or planned. But the amazing part of his story is that during more than 15 years of waiting on that promise, which, just to be clear, is longer than some of you have even been alive, David never stopped talking to God. He talked to God when he was lonely. He talked to God when he was surrounded by enemies. He talked to God when he was discouraged. He talked to God when he was angry and desperate. How do I know all this? Well, not only can you read about him doing this in 1 Samuel, but you'll also find him doing this in his Psalms. And if you're not sure what a psalm is, it's basically just a blanket term for a poem or a song or a prayer. It kind of includes them all together. And we find these in a book called Psalms. And in this book, we find a collection of these songs and prayers retelling the biblical story in a poetic way. Think of like the way an album of one of your favorite artists will poetically tell a story as you listen to the whole thing. And David wrote a good majority of what we find in the book of Psalms, 73 to be exact. And in the same way, a musician today will oftentimes be very raw and honest as they tell their story. So was David. In fact, as you read David's Psalms, you will find a couple things. You'll find him talking about his victories and blessings, as well as his many trials and hardships. You'll also find him sharing his fears and confessing his failures. But in the midst of it all, you still find him continuing to trust God with radical faith and offering thanks to his Redeemer. And so I would like to read a couple to you. And to start, I would like to read from Psalm 57, where we find David sharing his thoughts and prayers during one of his close encounters with Saul while he was on the run. Here, David writes, "Have mercy on me, O God. Have mercy. I look to you for protection. I will hide beneath the shadows of your wings until the danger passes by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who will fulfill his purpose for me. He will send help from heaven to rescue me, disgracing those who hound me. My God will send forth his unfailing love and faithfulness. I'm surrounded by fierce lions who greedily devour human prey, whose teeth pierce like spears and arrows, and whose tongues cut like swords. Be exalted, O God, above the highest heavens. May your glory shine over all the earth. When David was being hunted and eventually cornered by Saul and his men, it makes sense that David would be terrified, right? I mean, his life was being threatened. So I read this and I ask, why did David choose to cry out to God in his darkest moment? And as I think about that, the only conclusion I can come to is probably because he trusted God was actually listening. He believed that despite his terrifying circumstances, God would hear him. He believed God would hear his cries when he was in a pit of despair. And so this encourages me as I realize God hears us in our pits of fear and anxiety, discouragement, or doubt. But then we also find David writes in Psalm 66, where he says, "Come and listen, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he did for me. For I cried out to him for help, praising him as I spoke. If I had not confessed the sin in my heart, the Lord would have not listened to me. But God did listen. He paid attention to my prayer. Praise God, who did not ignore my prayer or withdraw his unfailing love from me." This one really encourages me, y'all. Because despite everything David had experienced, he was certain God heard his prayers. I mean, in Psalm 57, we see a David who is confident and believes God will hear him. And then in Psalm 66, we find him saying that he was certain that he did. In fact, he goes on to say, "I will tell you what God did for me," meaning that God had already come through. David was certain God listened because he saw and experienced firsthand God showing up and responding to his prayers. But this next one, I think, says a lot as to the reason why he did. David writes in Psalm 62, "Let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will not be shaken. My victory and honor come from God alone. He is my refuge, a rock where no enemy can reach me. Oh, my people, trust in him at all times. Pour out your heart to him, for God is our refuge." You see, David's experience with God all came down to a choice. While David waited for God to fulfill his promise to him, he chose to trust in God's faithfulness. While he waited, David never stopped talking to God because David knew that while we're waiting, God is listening. David believed this even when it didn't seem like it. And now looking back on his trials and circumstances, he sees it as more true than ever. And through his Psalms, encourages us to take the same confidence and attitude he did. And I can tell you God is listening too, not just because of what David wrote, but because I have seen it to be true in my own life as well. I still remember where I had my David moment, realizing God pays attention to my prayers. See, my brother was one of those in my family who didn't believe. And he actually lived in town, so we had conversations about life and faith on a much more regular basis. Yet, like the rest of my family, I felt like I was never getting anywhere and constantly wondered, are my efforts and my prayers for my brother making any difference? Then one day, my bro came to me and he basically told me, "Brandon, I believe everything." He told me how he had felt led to watch videos by a group called the Bible Project that I'd recommended. And he ended up binging through all of them. And as he did, it became so clear to him who Jesus was and what he had done for him. And that night, I remember praying and being so excited for my brother. I remember realizing that God was working where I couldn't, even though I couldn't see it. And so while I was waiting, God was listening to me. While David was waiting, God was listening to him. And while you're waiting, God is listening to you too. And so like it says in Psalm 62, where we find David saying, "Let all that I am wait quietly before God, for my hope is in him." I want to encourage you to do the same by doing two things. First, share your situation. God knows exactly what you're going through right now, but that doesn't mean God doesn't want to talk with you about it. When you pray, tell God what's happening. No matter why you have been waiting on God this week, I encourage you to practice praying about it. And secondly, share your feelings. My favorite part of David's Psalms are how honest and raw they are. He poured out all of his emotions to God, and you can do the same. Your feelings, even the ones you think might be ugly or embarrassing or inappropriate, don't intimidate or surprise God. So don't be afraid to express them. So whether you feel like you're waiting for God to fulfill a promise, or you're waiting for a prayer to be answered, or you're surrounded by enemies, or you need guidance about what step to take next, or you're just lonely, afraid, overwhelmed, angry, or discouraged, I want to encourage you with this. No matter where you're waiting on God, God never stops listening. So never stop talking to him. While David waited on God, God never stopped listening, and David never stopped praying. And so like David, I want to encourage you to do the same. Keep talking, keep praying, because while we're waiting, God is listening.